Managed Mentoring Guide for Getting Started in Beekeeping. Performing an initial inspection. I am Kevin England. In this lesson, we'll talk about how often to go into a hive, considerations for your first inspection, what the typical organization of a nest looks like, and we'll walk you through the overview of how to conduct your first hive inspection. A hive inspection is a foundational activity in beekeeping. Each one should have an intended purpose, be well planned, and be conducted with efficiency. The good news for you as a beekeeper is the need for inspections are relatively low in the beginning. While you're building your confidence, know that you really don't need to go in, but we give you permission to do inspections just to see what's going on. Chances are when you install a package or a colony, when it comes to them building out that first box, they should do it without any help from you. You really just want to keep the feeder topped off and there's not much more to it. Now, of course, you do need to check just to make sure that everything is going correctly, that they're building proper comb and that you don't have any queen problems. So we'll talk you through in this lesson how to do a basic inspection and what to look for. Now, how often do you go in and check on those things we just talked about? If you installed a package, we would recommend after the first inspection that you go in about every 10 to 14 days and monitor their progress. If you install a nucleus colony, you do want to go a little bit shorter duration, say 7 to 10 days. The reason being is, given they're a hive in miniature and have all the resources, they're going to move a little faster, and you just want to make sure that they don't get ahead of you. One thing we do not recommend is inspecting your bees all the time, meaning every couple days. It sets them back every time you open the colony. And unless they're progressing faster than conventional, which is possible, you'll tell by doing the inspections. 7 to 10 days for a nuke, 10 to 14 days for a package. First inspections, you're really just looking to see how well they got to work. Ideally, you're going to see them building out comb, left to right, top to bottom, in the right orientation. The opposite of not building that out properly is they're building it out into the face of the comb next to them, or the foundation. Too thick, not the width of your frame. They could also be building the orientation of the cells from front to back instead of across the face. If you run into those problems, you're going to scrape that comb off and tell them to restart again. And hopefully when they do, they'll build it across the face like you want. You need to keep an eye on this so that they don't get ahead of you and build comb poorly all the way through the hive. As to the queen laying, usually she'll lay eggs in a tight little pattern right in the center and go from center out, and you'll see the frames develop from new larvae to old larvae to capped larvae as your inspections progress. Let's talk about the timing for inspections. We'll start with time of the day. If you think about the way the colony operates, they get up and moving in the early morning. They do most of their forage during the heat of the day, and in the evening they collect at dusk to come back in and settle in for the overnight. It stands to reason that the best time to do inspection is when there's less bees in the hive, and the foragers tend to be a little more on guard. So if they're out foraging, that's a good time of day to be opening the hive. Ideally, and I know this is not suitable for everybody, especially if you work, you're going to go in the middle of the day, height of the sun, when the bees are doing most of the foraging. Work your plan out, do the best that you can to find that opportunity to go in and inspect your hives. Now we said 7 to 10 days or 10 to 14 days, depending on how you started, but you have to use your common sense. If there's bad weather in the area, if it's too cold, if it's a rainy, wet day, if it's few days right after installation and your bees have not settled in, then don't inspect the hive. Wait until a better opportunity presents. In the upcoming topics in these lessons, you're going to learn that we try to consider the fact that the brood nest is typically in a specific place in the hive. And ideally, when making entry on an inspection, you're going to go to the area where the bees are not. More on that in a moment, but making sure that you're trying to do your best not to kill your queen. The best way to do that is to go right to the middle of the brood nest, pull the heavy populated frames up and crush bees against bees and bars of the frames and inadvertently kill your queen. So keep in mind that whenever you're trying to make entry, from day 1 to day 100 to day whenever, always try to go in the area where there seems to be the least population and pull those frames first. Typically that's on the outside of the hive. Let's discuss that concept illustratively. On the left side, you see the typical 1 to 10. I'll talk about that in a second. And on the right side, you see an image of a perfect brood nest. This means that the queen got started right in the middle frames, 5 and 6. She started laying eggs. They start to build the nest through the middle of the hive. And ideally and typically, they would store pollen right to the outside in order to feed the new bees. On the periphery, they need resources for the workers and the new bees, so they'll store nectar and capped honey and so on in the outside. It's not typical for the queen to operate in those frames where there's food stores. She's going to operate in where the brood and pollen is. So on the right side, a perfect frame. Now, when you make entry, it stands to reason then that in the honey frame or honey and or pollen frames, they're frames 1 and 2 or 9 and 10 when you have the perfect setup. Now, bees are bees and they all do things differently. So I know we talked about the ideal layout, but you have to kind of read the frames. It might look like what's on the other side, the bottom frame. They could potentially store the brood and pollen on one side of the hive or the other. This is somewhat typical sometimes when you have your hive set where the sun hits one side and the queen will favor the warmer side of the hive, and maybe she'll move the brood nest to the other side. Read your frames, understand where your brood is, and make your entry away from the brood nest if at all possible. So we're going to take you through a basic inspection, just step by step. Try not to get crazy about taking notes or anything. Just listen to what we're saying here and kind of picture the motions that we're going through. The first thing is you're going to stand out and start your inspection from the outside of the hive. Make notes of the weather. Make notes of what the bees are doing. Look to see if any bees are orienting. Are they bringing in pollen from the outside? Put your bee suit on, light your smoker, and from the back of the hive, and again, just as a reminder, I like to say doggy, ducky, horsey, right? Tell it like you don't know it, and don't be offended if we repeat ourselves. Don't stand in front of the hive where the bees are coming and going. You'll be in the field of view for the workers that are guarding the hive and setting yourself up for stings. Smoke the front entrance of the hive. Pull the roof off of the hive. Give a little smoke through the top inner cover hole, and then use your hive tool to pry off that and make your entrance into the hive. You've pulled your inner cover off and now you're staring down at the box and you're looking at the top bars. One thing we'll caution you to do is not lean over the hive. It is highly likely that when you pull the cover off, the bees are going to come to the surface, meaning they'll be on the top bars and they'll be staring at you through the seams. They're in a guard motion, they're on alarm because you've done something and they're trying to figure out what's going on. If you lean over the box, you're going to cause alarm and they may leap off and come to try and sting you. The first prudent thing to do is take your smoker and lightly puff across the top of the frames in order to drive the bees down into the box. They will retreat from the smoke. You're not gassing them, you're just lightly giving a couple puffs, and if you wait just a few seconds, you're going to see noticeably fewer bees on the top bars. Now with the bees cleared, it's time to go get the first frame. One of the things that you want to do is not crush any bees with your hive tool. You could take the smoker every time you go down into the frame area and give a little puff of smoke. Maybe it's at the front of the frame and the back of the frame as you go to insert your hive tool. Let's talk about extracting that first frame. Go after frame number 2, not frame number 1. The reason being is frame number 1 faces the woodenware on one side, and if you pull the frame out, you crush the bees against the woodenware. It's better to go frame against frame where there's bees against bees. Take your hive tool, the blade end, the one that has the curve, stick that down in and give it a quarter turn, pull frame 1 back to the woodenware on the front and the back. That's going to open a bit of a gap. Go on the far side of frame number 2 and take your Hive tool, do the same motion, and pull frame 2 into the gap. Now switch to the blade end, take it and lay it on frame 1, insert the blade underneath the top bar of 2, and just give it a little push. When you pull it up, the frame will come up out of the box and you can grab it with your fingertips and pull it out of the box. Now, as you go on, the bees are going to glue the frames together with propolis. And maybe when you try to pull the frame up, eventually it's going to get stuck in there. You may have to take the blade end, go over to the other side of the frame, and leverage it up out of the box. Once you have both ends up and above the box, you can grab it with your fingertips and extract the frame. Slow and steady when you pull the frame. As you pull the frame out, you don't want to alarm bees, and they do not like fast, quick motions. Like a ballet, just extract the frame up slowly as it comes. And when you have the frame out, do note that you could have the queen on that frame, so you do not want to hold it over the ground. Hold it over the hive so that any bees that could potentially be hanging off the bottom of the frames, including the queen who's trying to get away from you, falls down into the hive and not onto the ground below. To reinforce why we pull frame number 2, one of the things to think about is you have 10 frames in the box, and if you've done it correctly, they're centered between the walls. There is a smidge of a gap. You have that space to pull the frame back, and that gap on the outside of frame number 1 between the frame and the woodenware, being it's a little bit bigger, sometimes the bees build comb out into that space. That means the comb is closer to the woodenware, and when you pull the frame back and pull it, maybe the wax is going to be closer to the frame and you're going to crush bees. And you do not want to crush bees because it sets off alarm pheromone. So pull frame 2 back into the space. Do it slowly so that any bees that could be pinched between the wax and the woodenware have time to get out, and then go get frame number 2, reiterating that if the bees on the outside of either side of the frame come up and rub against something, say wax on frame 1 or wax on frame 3 or other bees, they're bees against bees, and you're less likely to crush them as you pull the frame from the colony. The simplest way to proceed with your frame, what do you do with it after you get out of the box, is to hang it on a hanger. Now, sometimes we recommend a quiet box or other things, and we'll talk about that in some future. But for you, since you're only pulling one frame and using this method, a hanger is the perfect solution. We recommended you buy one of these for your kit, and now's the time to put it to use. You're going to take frame number 2 after checking to make sure that you don't see a queen on it, which is unlikely in the beginning, and you're going to set it on the hanger. One tip: do not lay it close against the box when you put it in the hanger. Keep it away so that the bees do not come off the face that's against the woodenware and get onto the outside of the hive. Eventually, you're going to take that frame and put it back in the box and take the hanger away, and you don't want a bunch of bees trying to walk around on the outside, come up over the edge of the hive to come back inside while you're trying to put your cover back on, and you end up crushing bees. So what are you going to see? First frame, taking it out, there may be a handful of bees, and it might look just like this. What you're looking at is a frame with foundation and very fresh, white, clean, brand new wax. This is highly likely what you will see. They'll build it out. It's going to be very tender wax. You'll see in time that wax will develop. It gets reinforced. It changes colors when the bees walk around on it. But in the beginning, your hive will look wondrously white, clean, pristine wax with a handful of bees probably clustered around. And what they're doing is doing maintenance on the wax, cleaning the cells and things like that. Or they're just resting if they're foragers. There could be a number of activities going on. Just take a peek at the bees every once in a while. And we see that a lot of beekeepers do hive inspections and they never actually take the time to look at the bees. When you pull that first frame, just take a moment before you hang it on the hanger and look at the frame design, what the bees did and what the bees are doing. The whole colony revolves around the queen laying eggs and growing the population. It stands to reason then that one of the first things you are looking for is evidence of eggs in the cells. I want to say something now about looking for eggs. Most new beekeepers are encouraged on first inspection to look for eggs, and there will be a time when that skill becomes an imperative for you. But know this for your first inspection. If you see a larva, then you know you have a working queen. I point this out because in the beginning of your journey, you're new to this and not quite sure what you're looking at. Do not stress yourself out on your first inspection if you did not see eggs. They're hard to find. If you see a larva, you have a working queen and it's mission accomplished. Okay, that out of the way, we should talk about what an egg looks like so we can learn to look for them. They're often described as looking like a grain of rice, and that's a fair description. But in comparison, it's a bit short because a honeybee egg is only a quarter to a third of the size of a grain of rice. It's tiny, and when you see one right after the queen has deposited it into the cell, it's going to be standing on one end, which makes it even harder to see because of the profile. Now, in time, it's going to lay flat, and as it grows, in the grub form, it's going to curl into a C shape and it'll look like a little fat worm swimming in a pool of liquid. This is an expansion of what that frame snippet looks like. And in this case, you could clearly see the difference between an egg and a larva, which eventually will be capped by the bees and become capped brood. Over to the left, you'll see an indication of pollen. That is always nearby somewhere to the eggs and the larvae that are being tended by the bees. Being very clear, this image is more representative of what you're going to see when you open your hive in the beginning. If you had a nuke, which had developed comb, it looks like the one we just looked at. But if you install a package, it's going to look like this. Very fresh, young comb, and you're going to have what we refer to as brood in all stages. And what we mean by that is in the lower left side, you'll see eggs down in the cell. They graduate to small C-shaped larvae, and then they become big plump larvae, and the ones right in the middle are almost at the cusp of standing up inside the cell and being capped by the bees. Chances are on your first inspection, this is what you're going to see, brood in all stages. Now, one thing you'll note, I picked this picture on purpose because it's rather fuzzy. It's soft focus. This is actually more clear than what you're going to see at times. When you're looking at a honeybee frame in the dark, looking down into the dark cells, it's hard to see sometimes, and it might be a little complicated and difficult for your eyes to adjust. One recommendation is you pull the frame out, you turn so that the sun is behind your back shoulder and lit down into the bottom of the cells, and you tilt the frame back and forth until you get that right angle where your eyes make direct connection down into the bottom of the cell, and this becomes far clearer to be able to see what's inside the cells. If you have a package hive, chances are your population is not going to be this crazy. You're not going to see bees covering every inch of the comb, but if you're starting out with a nuke, this is very possible. You might want to say to yourself, I can't see underneath the bees. And a lot of beekeepers will tell you, never blow on the bees. I do it all the time. Just a light puff will move the bees. They feel the air and they move away. You're wearing a veil, and if you do happen to cause alarm to them and they come and jump up, they're going to come to your screen. Just make sure your face is not against the veil or you get stung on the lips. One thing you do not have to look for in your first inspection is for the queen. Really just look for brood in all stages, whether it's a nuke or it's an installed package, and you'll know that you have a queen. Now, if you spot the queen, all the better. And if you bought a queen that was marked, that might be a little bit easier. But in this case, the queen is right there. She's in this picture, and it may be hard for you as a new beekeeper to get that sense of where she is and how to find her. Don't stress yourself out over this. So let me reground you at where we are in the process. You've pulled frame number 2, you've looked for the queen, you didn't find her, you hung it on the hanger. Maybe you've took a peek at number 1, but chances are there isn't much on it, especially if you're in a package hive. And you're working your way through the frames to see if you could find evidence of brood, just like we talked about. If you find evidence of brood, mission accomplished. Good to go, close everything up, or peek around a bit, but be aware that in early days of April, which is customary for this time frame of watching this presentation, it might be chilly. Don't cool the bees off too much. When you hold a frame out in the air, you're chilling the brood, and you want to make sure that you don't damage the larva that the colony is trying to raise. One thing that I want to say to you is pull frame number 2, look for the queen, put it on the hanger. Then go to frame number 3. Look for the queen, just glance through and see if you see her. If you do find the queen, put her back. Take it and put it back into the slot, slide it into the hole, and go after the next frames looking for a larva. Try not to be holding the frame with the queen out above the colony too long. Really, you want to put her back in there for safekeeping. Keep going until you get to mission accomplished, and then put everything back together. Let's come back to our inspection. We had pulled frame number 2, placed it on the hanger, took a peek at frame number 1 if that was interesting, and now we're going to go into frame number 3. Remove it from the hive, look to see if it has what you need to know, maybe brood in all stages is what you're looking for, and if it doesn't, you can continue through the hive. The way you do that is take frame number 3, put it back into the slot where number 2 was, and pull it tight against number 1. That's going to create a gap to the right of frame number 3 for you to pull number 4 into and extract the hive without it being next to frame number 5. You'll slide it into the gap, pull it out, inspect it, and you can continue that process for 5, 6, 7 as you go on. Do that until you meet your objective, and then you can reverse course and put everything back together. As to putting everything back together, it's a pretty simple affair. You're just going to use your hive tool to slide the frames back to their original position, leaving the gap for frame number 2. Take number 2 off of the frame hanger, put it back in its original position so all the frames are back in the way that they were pulled from the hive. Scooch all the frames together, making sure that all the frame shoulders are tight. Don't leave any gaps or the bees will build propolis in between them. Grab your inner cover, grab your roof, cover things off, and complete your inspection. I know this was a lot to take in, but the next lesson we're going to actually show you how to use your hive tool, and we're going to run it through again, and in that we'll actually have pictures of moving the slides around, so it might be easier to reinforce for you. To get into the lesson, we said take the roof off, take the inner cover off, and get to the bees. And we talked about the technique of smoking the bees down into the hive. We kind of glossed over what do you do with the bees that are on the roof and on the inner cover. Let's take a moment to discuss that, and we'll talk about 2 alternatives. First one, simplest one, is just take those pieces and set them aside. Know that they still have bees on them. But eventually you will put them back on the hive, and either the bees will fly off of them or you're going to have to dislodge them from those pieces before you put them back so you don't crush bees. And more on that in a moment. One recommendation that we have is when you take the inner cover off, if you're going to leave the bees on it, is to walk around the front of the hive and lean the inner cover, which is likely to have the most bees on it, against your front entrance, right against the bottom board. Now don't block the entrance. You don't want to block bees coming and going. If you set it across the front of the hive and bees can't come and go, they're going to end up being disoriented and there'll be a lot of bees in the air in short order. What you want to do is lean it in some way where it's touching the bottom board and the bees can walk up over the inner cover and into the hive. And they will probably all clear that device by the time you're done with your inspection. Now the other option is to wrap or knock the bees off or shake them off into the hive and let's talk about how you do that. When you're looking to dislodge the bees into the hive, there's two methods you can cover. The first one we'll talk about is the shake process. Not a formal name for it, just a label I'm giving it. You hold the frame or the inner cover or the roof, whatever it may be you're using. In this case, let's talk about an inner cover up at eye level, right in front of you, over top of the hive. You bring it down in a rapid fashion and you stop quickly. When you do, the amount of force exerted to the bees hanging on to the piece of equipment is so high that they lose grip and they fall down into the box below them. Now, some of them might take flight, but if they do, they typically fly around for a little bit and then go over to the entrance of the hive and walk inside. The second process, one that I employ mostly, my personal preference, is to rap or knock on the piece of equipment. In the case of the inner cover, you would hold it up in front of you over top of the hive, and like swinging a hammer to a gavel, you would make a fist, making sure the area you're going to blow is clear, and you would bring your fist down, delivering a sharp rap to whatever the piece of equipment is. The jolt from the blow is going to knock the bees down off of the piece of equipment, and like the shake method, they will fall down into the equipment below. Do you need to clear the bees off these pieces of equipment? The short answer is probably yes. One of the key things when you're putting the hive back together is you do not want to be crushing bees. Take your smoker and smoke around the edges of the box before you put your inner cover down. Make sure that you've cleared the bees from the inner cover and set it down. If and when you go to do this, it's likely that bees are going to be walking in and out of the box, and sometimes on those edges, you'll smoke the edges and a bee will return and come right up. There's a process to clear the bees, which is to take the inner cover and set it down on the woodenware over the bees. You're going to put just a little bit pressure, but you're not going to let the full weight of the inner cover set on the bees. They will feel that pressure and they will scurry out of the way. And when the woodenware is clear, you can feel free to put it down. Now, the other thing that happens when you go to put the roof back on is that bees will be walking around on the roof. And if you put it down in a certain way where it meets up with the inner cover, it's going to crush some bees. It really is a good idea to get all the bees off of the roof before you go and put it on the inner cover. Sometimes the best way to do that is just scooch them off the frames. Take your finger, use the fingernail if you're barehanded, and get behind the bee and just give it a moderate flick. Flick. And when you do that, the bee is going to scoot off, take to the air, and you can go through and sweep or flick off any bees. And if you keep flicking them, eventually they'll land. Now, sometimes they fly up in the air and then they come right back and land in the spot they were in a minute. And you have to coax them a couple times. But eventually, if you take a moment, you can clear all of them and then give a little smoke around the ring of the inner cover and set your roof down and know that you haven't crushed any bees. Now, a telltale sign is if you keep coming into the hive and you're pulling your inner cover and roof and you're seeing crushed bees, you need to spend a little more time making sure that you pay attention to this detail. One final tip for inspecting frames: when you pull a frame from its slot, hold it out in front of you. Turn your body so that the light from the sun is behind you, and the tip is to look at the ground in front of you for your shadow. Tilt the top of the frame in a manner that allows the light to shine directly into the bottom of the depth of the cells. This makes it immeasurably easier to see the contents of the cell. Incidentally, there's a queen on the lower third of this image around the center of the frame. Look for that white dot. We did it. We walked through a basic inspection step by step, how to pull the frames, what to be looking for in a general sense. And going forward, we'll cover that in a little more detail. Upcoming next is the Hive tool demonstration of showing you more graphical depictions of how to actually place your Hive tool, use it in extracting the frames. We'll talk about feeding new colonies, record keeping, equipment prep for future, and one of the things that we'll get to is things you will see. So in your inspections, look, in the beginning, you're really just looking to see, is the queen laying and are they forming good comb? But in time, there's a number of things you'll read doing a basic inspection. We'll cover off some of those things in an upcoming lesson. If you have questions about what we covered, you can come to the online session and ask in that forum. You can also send an email to the email address on the screen. If you're watching from YouTube, you can leave a comment below. Incidentally, if you're on our website and hover over the video, there'll be a link to click to go to YouTube, and when you get there, please do subscribe. Thanks for watching the lesson. We'll catch you next time when we move to Hive tools.